Welcome back to our discussion of the Empire State of the South, and we're going to be looking at the state of Texas from 1846, when it became a state, until 1861. Of course, the beginning of the Civil War, and that during that time period of the Civil War, Texas left the United States and joined the Confederate States of America, which will be the subject of the next lecture. This lecture on the Empire State of the South is divided in two parts, and so this is the first part. Okay, you may or may not recall that New York State is called the Empire State, and that is believed because of its riches and natural resources. No one knows the exact origin of the phrase Empire State as applied to New York, but many people think it's because the state has such natural resources and such riches that people said, well, it's almost like an empire because of its size and riches. And of course, the famous Empire State Building was built in New York City in the 1930s. Now we're going to look at the economy, first of all, of Texas before the war. Antebellum means before the war, in this case, before the Civil War. And then we'll also look a little more in part two at society and politics in Texas during this period of time. The state was essentially based on agriculture before the Civil War, and most farmers did not employ slaves. And I'll talk a bit more about slavery in general in the southern states, and because Texas is best considered a southern state during this period of time. And most farmers who had what are called cash crop farms, this means that they produce enough in terms of crops to eat, and they'll have some hogs running wild that will just eat whatever they can, which they use to produce pork, and then the surplus is sold. So those who didn't employ slave labor, which is the majority, had what's called subsistence farms. They raised enough hogs to produce pork. They had enough vegetables and corn to meet the needs of the humans who lived on the farm, as well as the needs of the livestock, and they sold whatever surplus they had. These small farms without slaves grew small amounts of cotton for sale on the side, but as we will see, the vast amount of cotton produced in this state, some 90%, was produced on large farms or plantations with slaves. Now, only about 1/3 of the farmers in Texas had slaves. So that means obviously 2/3 didn't have slaves. And the vast majority of the farmers who had slaves were Anglos. They were not Tejanos, although some Tejanos did have slaves. And as I mentioned a moment ago, they grew corn and vegetables for their consumption. Very little wheat was consumed because it was a luxury, because wheat was not grown in Texas. And they had hogs, milk cows, and some cattle on the farm usually, which they slaughtered for meat. When they planted cotton or sugar, that was for sale. Obviously, they weren't going to consume much cotton or sugar on the small farms. The slave plantations produced about 90% or virtually all of the cotton. And the reason for that is the process of growing cotton is very, very labor intensive. You need a lot of labor, particularly at the harvest time, to pick the cotton, and you have to pick it fairly quickly. Also, while the cotton plants are growing, it's necessary to do extensive weeding and preparation, then preparation of the fields for the next planting. So we're going to spend the next part, actually the rest of part one here, talking about slavery, slavery in Texas, and then since Texas is essentially a southern state in both its economy and culture, we'll take a broader view of slavery in the entire south of the United States. Now, the black population, the slave population, grew much more rapidly during this period than the white population, which consisted of white immigrants from southern states, from slave states, or, as we will see, immigrants from Germany. And the black slaves, of course, were not voluntarily immigrated to Texas, but rather they were forced to go with their owners, or they were sold from the southern part of the United States to cotton farmers who needed more slaves. Slaves accounted for about 1/3 of the entire population of Texas during this 15-year period. And in 1860, on the outbreak of the Civil War, there were about 183,000 slaves in Texas. And virtually all of these slaves were in the eastern 40% of the state, because, and you could look at a line that essentially goes near San Antonio up through Austin and north. And to the west of that line, there was very, very little slavery, and the slaves were to the east of the line. The reason has to do with the soil and the rainfall. The western part of Texas was just too dry for cotton production, and during this time period, obviously, they didn't have electric pumps for irrigation and whatnot. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, Texas was essentially a southern state, and it's important to keep that in mind, both economically and culturally. In fact, by the 1850s, about 3/4 of the families in Texas, these are the Anglo families, were headed by people who had been born in the South. And of these families, about 1/4 of them owned at least one slave. Now, slaves performed a wide range of tasks. They performed all the needed farm work, particularly the heavy work that the whites didn't want to do. They took care of the cows and the hogs. They did child care, not only of their own children, but the slave owners' children. They did all the cooking, not only for the slaves, but also for the white owners and their family. They cleaned the owner's house, and they also engaged in a lot of skilled craft work. On larger plantations, they might make simple furniture, or put horseshoes on horses and whatnot. And in fact, about 10 or 20% of slaves in Texas did what was considered skilled labor. Only about 5% of the slaves lived in the urban centers, or the small cities. There were no really large cities in Texas. And they worked either as domestic servants or day laborers. Now, this is an early photograph of a slave family in front of its cabin. You can see it's made of logs. You can see a chimney in the background. It had a chimney. And the fireplace was used both for cooking and also for warmth in the winter. Over this 15-year time period, more and more of the farmers with slaves grew cotton, and they grew the cotton to be exported from Texas. There was only one a small cotton mill in Texas, or textile mill. So it was exported either to the northern part of the United States or Britain and France, but largely to Britain. And these slaveholding farmers, who again were the minority of farmers, they produced 90% of all Texas cotton exports during this time period. And cotton was by far the major export of Texas. Now, from the 1820s, at a time when Texas, of course, was still part of Mexico, until the late 1850s, until the outbreak of the Civil War, Texas cotton production really skyrocketed because the price of cotton went up significantly in the northern part of the United States and in Europe. And so this was a very, very profitable business. It was very profitable for the slaveholders to own slaves because of the amount of cotton they could produce. And this increased demand for cotton was due to the number of textile mills in both the northern part of the United States and Britain. A textile mill is an early factory. At first, they were powered by water. They put a large wheel, like a paddle wheel, in a fast-moving stream, and that would power the machines. Later, they switched to the very earliest steam engines, and the cotton went to the mills, and it was spun, first of all, into threads, and then the threads were used to produce all sorts of cotton fabrics, ranging from cotton cloth, which was used to to make all types of clothing, sheets, and whatnot. And the real key to the increased production of cotton, which made the textiles profitable, was Eli Whitney's cotton gin. That's a typo. That should be Whitney with a Y instead of an R. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which removed the seeds efficiently. When cotton grows, and perhaps you've seen it here in Texas, there's a lot you can see growing along the sides of the road as you head out of the Houston area. It has large, puffy balls of cotton fabric, white, and the seeds have to be removed. It's quite difficult to remove the seeds. They kind of stick in there. And so that was done at first by hand. And so it was simply not profitable to grow cotton, even if someone had, let's say, 100 slaves. Most of the slaves their job was just to pull the seeds out of the cotton. Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin to remove those seeds efficiently, and this greatly, greatly increased the production of cotton, and the textile mills could buy all the cotton that was produced and more. The net result of this was there was an increased demand to have slaves out in the fields to grow more cotton. This was not good news for the slaves, because that meant for the slaves they were working many more hours in the hot sun. And in fact, slaveholders in some of the northern parts of the South would sell their slaves because the slaves would fetch a much higher price growing cotton in the deep South than they would growing tobacco in the areas like Virginia. A little more on the cotton gin, which I'm sure you've studied in previous courses. The word gin is a shortened version of saying engine. It's a cotton engine. It produces cotton without seeds. How does it do it? Well, it's effectively like a comb, like combing your hair. If you comb your hair, it takes the tangles out. And if you had bits of debris or something in your hair, because you're outside, it would take the debris out. Well, this is all it is a large comb, like a big comb that turns around and the cotton goes through, and the comb very effectively takes out all the seeds. Eli Whitney was not an agricultural engineer. He was from the north. He was working as a tutor in the home of a wealthy planter in the south, and the planter was complaining about how most of the slaves had to sit on the ground and just spent all day taking the seeds out. So Eli Whitney was back in his room after lunch, and he was combing his hair and said, "Oh, well, we developed something like this." So he came up with the idea of a cotton gin. It's one of those things that's a very simple idea. It's amazing no one had thought of it before. This is a drawing from the time of a cotton gin on a plantation. You can see the raw cotton coming down the chute, and you can see the little seeds in there. And the machine in front of the slave with the rake has, in effect, it's like a big comb, and it would go through the cotton and pull out all the seeds. And then the cotton would go down and fall down to the room below. Now, what powered this, if you look on the left side of this machine, you can see a belt, and that is a belt made of either cowhide or buffalo hide that goes down below, and that could be turned by a river nearby, or most likely it's turned by horses or mules just going in a circle and turning that belt. As time progressed, the wealthier plantations would have steam engines. A very, very simple concept, but it was absolutely revolutionary in the production of cotton. Now, one problem for cotton producers, particularly at this time with no artificial fertilizers and no real scientific method of irrigating or plowing the fields, was the cotton sucked the nutrients out of the soil as it grew. So after a few years, the soil was simply not as productive as it used to be. And so the cotton plantations, the cotton planters wanted to move west and have additional soil. Now, of course, to replenish the nutrients in the fields, farmers know how to plow under certain crops. Often they won't have a crop for a year. They'll plant things of a certain type of bean that produces nitrogen, and then they plow that bean into the soil, or they can use chemical fertilizers. Well, they didn't really know how to do any of that back then. And so this explains the great pressure by the Southerners to get more land to the west, which meant for cotton having slavery. Now, the Mississippi River was known as the Cotton Highway because most of the cotton, not from Texas, but from, we'll see a map in a minute, Louisiana and other areas, was shipped down the Mississippi River. Big bundles of cotton were shipped down on ship, and then they were exported to New York, New England, places like Boston, Britain, and France. In fact, cotton became so valuable as a crop that it was called king cotton, or it was also called white gold, because so much money could be made from cultivating cotton. Now, in contrast, both sugarcane and rice was very expensive to produce, because on the large farms, they had to have machinery to process either the sugarcane or rice before shipping it. Whereas cotton, all that was done was taking the seeds out and then shipping it like it was. And there were two crucial inventions that made cotton such a valuable commodity. One was the cotton gin, which we just discussed. The other was textile machinery. In the first factories of the Industrial Revolution, the first factories produced textiles or cotton cloth. There are two industrial revolutions. The first one is in this period of time, starting around 1790 up to the Civil War. The second one is after the Civil War, and that's the one that most people think of, the Industrial Revolution. And this is when you had large factories with steam power producing all sorts of products, But before the Civil War, textiles was the world's largest industry, and that was headquartered or centered in Britain. Now here we see the stereotypical view of a southern cotton plantation. You could look at this painting. Some like this existed, but most were much smaller, as I'll explain. So what you see, you can tell it's the south. You could look in the upper right-hand corner, and you can see the moss hanging down from the large trees. You can see a steamboat going up the river, and this could be the Mississippi River or some other large rivers. You see on the left of the painting a beautiful mansion, and you can see in the lower left of the painting the cotton field. You can see the cotton balls there, and you can see the slaves picking the cotton. And this is the stereotypical view of a slave plantation, but most were not as large as this. And this is the sort of view, if you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, made in the late 1930s, where you have, in movies like that, they depict the slaves as singing and happy. You have the slaves working in the house, and you have the slaveholder and the children. The men are all handsome men riding horses, and the women are all beautiful women wearing these long dresses, the kind, I forgot what you call them, the hoop dresses that come out. That's the stereotypical view of slavery. There were some plantations that large, but they were not the typical ones. Now, looking at the South as a whole, and again, Texas is part of the South at this period of time, less than 1/3 of Southern whites owned slaves. And we saw in Texas it was about 1/3 of the whites in Texas owned slaves. Across the South, that's the ratio. And in Texas and the rest of the South, most of the slave owners owned small farms with just a few slaves, not hundreds and hundreds of slaves. They didn't have huge plantations like the painting we just saw. And in fact, the majority of Southern whites were yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers, they worked by themselves with their family on the land. And in Texas in particular, there were no white people to hire to help work on the land because land was so cheap. All the white people virtually who went to Texas could get their own land. So the situation in Texas was essentially the same as that in the rest of the South. And most slaveholders had fewer than 10 slaves. But particularly the majority of slaves lived on larger plantations where the slaveholders owned 10 or more slaves, because some of the plantations, like that of George Washington at Mount Vernon in Virginia, he had several hundred slaves. Now this is a painting from the time of sort of a smaller farm. You can see in the background the house. It's not a huge mansion. It's a very nice house. And you can see working in the fields there, 3 slaves. There may be a couple more. You see some in the back, perhaps, in the vegetable garden. And you see the white men out working in the fields. You see one man on a horse, and then another in the background who is guiding a mule or donkey, pulling some sort of early agricultural implement. And on that early agricultural implement is standing another white man, and there's another white man on the left. So what would happen in a farm like this is the whites generally would be out in the field, and of course they would have the black slaves doing the very, very heavy work. Now let's look at the slave population, how it greatly increased from 1820 until 1860. And then let's look at cotton production, and you'll see they're highly correlated. This map is the slave population in 1820. Now, of course, here we don't even see Texas on the map as part of the United States, because in 1820, Texas, as we saw, was part of the Spanish Empire. Now, each dot on this map represents 200 slaves. So you can see some slaves down there near New Orleans, Louisiana, and, up the Mississippi River area. But the vast majority of slaves were where? Well, they were over in Virginia. You can see where it looks solid red. And they are producing tobacco. And then down in South Carolina, Georgia area, where it's solid red along the coast, they're producing sugar cane or indigo. Indigo, of course, was a dye, a plant that produced a purple color that was in much demand to dye textiles. It's also interesting, you look at this map of the slave population in 1820, you can see slaves in the north, can't you? You can see on the right-hand side, about 3/4 of the way up, that's New York State. So there were slaves in New York City working on the docks, doing the heavy work. And going up there, some worked on farms, but most of them worked on docks. And some were servants. And you also have below that, that's the state of New Jersey, where again, there were, many thousands of slaves. Now let's jump from 1820 to 1860. Okay, this is 1860, and by now, of course, we see Texas is in the United States. It has been for about 15 years. And now let's look at the slaves. Again, each dot represents the same number of slaves as the previous map. Well, you can see there are more slaves up in the Virginia area, and there are none in the north, because the states in the north, New Jersey, New York, they had all abolished slavery in their states. So you can see a lot of slaves still on the East Coast from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Again, producing tobacco, sugarcane, and indigo. But now you see more and more slaves around Louisiana area, and you can see in East Texas. And as I mentioned before, the slaves in Texas were almost exclusively in the eastern 40% of the state. So you look at Texas there, and it sort of stops more or less near San Antonio, and then you could draw a line vertically, and the slaves are to the east of that, with virtually none to the west. Now let's look at cotton production the same time period. This is 1821. Again, Texas is still part of Spain. And you can see relatively little cotton production. Each dot represents 1,000 bales of cotton. A bale of cotton is 500 pounds of cotton, which is bundled together. I'll show you a photo of that in a minute. And you can see the cotton production is largely in South Carolina, Georgia. That's the cotton belt coming across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. It's scattered. There's not significant amount of cotton production. Now we're going to fast forward 40 years to 1860, And again, each dot represents 1,000 bales of cotton. Wow, look at this difference. Well, first of all, we see Texas as a state. Look at the dots for cotton production. It's just a big black area along the Mississippi River. If you look where New Orleans, Louisiana is, going north, that was really the major part of the cotton belt. You can go to the right or to the east of that, and there was a railroad built there, an early railroad, to bring cotton from those plantations to the Mississippi River. Then you look in Texas. You can see Texas was not the major producer in the United States, not by far, but it was producing a significant amount of cotton in East Texas. And then you can see down Houston area, you can see there's a lot of cotton produced. Well, as promised, here are the photos of bales of cotton. Each of these bundles of cotton, which weigh 500 pounds each, are called a bale. This is a photo taken in the docks in New Orleans. You can see the men standing there. This is cotton waiting to be shipped, and this goes for almost a half mile, an incredible amount of cotton. And there are the ships in the background waiting to take the cotton. This photo was taken a little after the Civil War, but you can see the cotton ready to be taken to markets. Excuse me. I particularly like these two maps. There's a lot to look at, so we'll take it slowly here. And I'm sorry, they're all on the same slide. The first map at the top of the page is 1820. And the colors here represent the percentage of slaves in the total population for counties. So as you can see in the legend, if it's red, that means over 50% of the population in that county is a slave. Orange is 30 to 49%. The yellowish color is 10 to 29, and et cetera, et cetera. So look at this map, 1820. Remember, at this point, there's relatively little cotton production. So you can see up in Virginia, you can see a good portion of Virginia, over 50% of the population in each county was a slave. There was some cotton production there, and you can see, it's hard to see, but you have to squint. It's outlined in green, South Carolina, Georgia, and then coming down in Louisiana along the Mississippi River. But in real contrast, look at the map below it. That's 1860, just before the Civil War. Of course, Texas is now part of the United States. And what you'll see there is a huge area in red going all the way from South Carolina on the east across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and into East Texas. That entire area in the United States, over half of the population was slaves. And in some areas it was 80 to 90%. And you can see it's very difficult to look. You have to look very carefully. Outlined in green is the cotton producing area. And it's essentially the entire area from South Carolina to the west. And that's the famous cotton belt. This is where so much cotton was grown. And of course, it was virtually all grown and produced by slaves. And you can see right next to Houston, near the coast, it's well over 50%. Moving up this whole area, Katy, Fort Bend County, it was 50, 60% slave. And a little north of here, it was 30 to 50% slaves. So a high percentage of slaves in the overall population. Looking at Texas on this map, if you look, to the west of the cotton producing area, you can see there's some slaves, but then further west, there are virtually none. Now this map shows the same thing. This was produced after the Civil War broke out, this map, and it's the slaves in U.S. population. And I've circled in red the huge number around the Brazos River area. And you can see at the top, it says sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers of the U.S. Army, who were, of course, at this time fighting the South. So this was, sold in the North, so Northerners could see the terrible institution of slavery and how prevalent it was. Now let's zero in on Texas, since this is a course in Texas history. This is a map not of all of Texas, but the eastern part of Texas, the eastern 2/3 of Texas that have slaves. And I circled in the legend it's the counties with 50% or more slaves, and you can see those are the areas with horizontal lines. And I circled on the map in red the area just to the just to the west of Houston, where there 70-80% of the population are slaves. And this goes all the way down to the coast. And you can see just above that the counties that have the dots. Those are 25 to 50% slaves. So high concentration of slaves and moving up into East Texas. This is a map of the same area, and it shows where there are horizontal lines. Those are counties that have more than 1,000 slaves. And it's very similar to the other area. You can see it's the entire area east of Houston, north of Houston, going all the way to Louisiana in the east and up north. The other counties shown here had slaves, but fewer than 1,000 slaves. Now, this is a map I saw in a former plantation in South Texas in Brazoria County. And I liked the map I'm going to show you in a minute so much I took a photograph. So what we're going to see here is a map of the United States in 1859 or 1860, showing the different crops that are produced. So what we'll see here is cotton is the light blue, tobacco is the green, sugar is a really dark green, and rice is the red. Okay, so this is the map, 1860 plantation economies. So the light blue is cotton. Can you see that cotton belt? It goes all the way over from North Carolina, all through there. That's the cotton producing area. And it comes down, and the entire area we're in, you can see in Texas, it goes right to San Antonio and almost to Austin. That's the cotton belt of the United States. Now the area just south of Houston, you can see dark green. That is sugar. And why sugar there? Because there's more rainfall and it's actually hotter and more humid than here. Moving from Houston to the east, where you have the New Orleans area, southern Louisiana, you can see that's dark green. That's sugar also. Continuing across to the east, you see the area in reddish, and that's indigo. And then moving north into Virginia, the darker green is that color is tobacco, and that's in the center part also. So these are plantation economies is the map, and it really shows at a glance the importance of cotton and secondarily of sugar, tobacco, and rice. Should be on the right is not indigo, that's rice. On the eastern side, that is rice with some indigo. And all of these are crops that required slave labor to be competitive at this time. Now, just south of Houston, about 45 minutes south of the Katy area where I live, is the Warner Hog Plantation. This is the plantation house which you could go and visit. Now, this house was built by the slaves. This was not a cotton plantation, but a sugar plantation. And as I mentioned before, there were relatively few sugar plantations because you had to invest a lot of money into the machinery to process the sugar cane. They had to crush it and boil it into a syrup like molasses. This particular plantation south of Houston had 66 slaves who built the house. They built the smokehouse. The smokehouse was a small building. As the name suggests, they had a fire going, produced a lot of smoke, and they would hang up the meats, principally ham or pork. They put pork up and they would smoke it so it would last a long time, which was important in a day and age without refrigeration. It also had a sugar mill, and the slaves worked on the fields. And when you go to these plantations also, it's very, very interesting to see the ice houses. Now, what is an ice house? An ice house is underground, well insulated underground with sawdust and bricks. And ice was purchased from the northern states. There was a man in Boston, Massachusetts, who was a real entrepreneur, and he thought, well, what can I produce? What do we have here in Boston, Massachusetts? And he was thinking of this in the middle of the winter, and it is really cold in Boston, Massachusetts area in the winter. The lakes would all freeze with 1 or 2 feet of ice. So he came up with a brilliant idea, and this is the day and age before refrigeration, of selling ice. Well, how do you do that? Well, he had teams of horses go out with something that looked like a plow that was sharp, and it would go across the lakes and cut huge blocks of ice, put those blocks of ice in ships that were specially constructed. These were sailboats with lots of sawdust and insulation. And this gentleman would export the ice from Boston, Massachusetts to Houston, where people would buy it, wealthy people. They'd put it underground in ice houses where it would last all winter. It would arrive in Houston, let's say in March or April. But this gentleman in Boston, Massachusetts would also ship the rice to Cuba. And hard to believe, he even shipped the ice to China and India. And so a sailing boat would take several months to reach India, during which period of time, because the boat was so well insulated, only about 5% of the ice would melt. So that's what you call a real entrepreneur. If anyone is interested, I can be happy to give you the title of a very short book. It's like a 150-page book, and it talks about this entrepreneur who was literally exporting ice around the world at very low prices, and that ended, of course, when with electric refrigerators. Okay, this is the end of part 1, and in part 2, we'll look at the non-slave aspects of the economy. We'll look some at the society and a bit at the politics of this period. Thank you.